Okay, well, thank you, Stan, and thanks for inviting me to speak, and thanks all of you for coming, although you haven't come, but you're here in your own way. So for those who don't know me, I'm a historian of Italian communism, and this year I'm bringing out a book on the reformation of the Italian Communist Party during World War II. And here I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which that's connected to Antonio Gramsci as a figure, and indeed the way he became an icon of the Communist Party during that period, having died a few years earlier in 1937. But I'll start by emphasizing why I talk about the misuses of Gramsci. Little of what I'm going to say is a critique of Gramsci's own record or writing, but has more to do with the representations and uses of him. It would be impossible to provide an in-depth survey of the literally tens of thousands of works about Gramsci. But I think we can say the main types of misrepresentation of Gramsci break down into two, in some ways, distinct fields. So the first is the treatment of Gramsci by the Italian Communist Party under Palmiro Togliatti in creating a foundation myth for the PCI in the period of World War II. So 2 decades after the party had actually been first created in 1921, and also after Gramsci had himself died. Broadly, this use of Gramsci was oriented to the idea of creating a distinctly Italian road to socialism. Though Stan hinted, others beyond Italy would also draw on the PCI as a kind of model, most obviously with the rise of Euro-communism from the mid-1970s onwards. The second general type of misuses of Gramsci, which I'll talk about a bit less, revolve around his deployment as a kind of philosopher or political scientist in academia, especially since the 1980s, mainly in Anglophone countries, South Asia and Latin America, and rather less in Italy. In the large majority, what these approaches seek to do is to extract certain analytical categories of Gramsci, categories from Gramsci, but sort of unpin them from his own sort of political intentions, but in particular take categories of his in kind of understanding the state and understanding the formation of political hegemony, and separate these from his own sort of central historical actor, the Communist Party, and its project for the socialist transformation of society. Of course, to accuse others of misuses might imply I'm trying to defend a kind of Gramscian orthodoxy. But if anything, I think the challenge is to assert the kind of communist and political character of his work at all. Since Perry Anderson's 1976 essay, Considerations on Western Marxism, it's been commonplace to see Gramsci as a figure within the first generation of so-called Western Marxists, as opposed to the so-called Eastern Marxism represented by the building of socialism, so-called in the USSR and its various satellites and imitators. In the then Trotskyist influenced Anderson's reading, though we can see something similar indeed in harsher tones in Domenico Lacerdo's more recent work on Western Marxism, Lacerdo being a Marxist-Leninist. So in this view, Western Marxism embodies a separation of Marxism from political practice, intensified across the first half of the 20th century. Hence why, for instance, thinkers like the Frankfurt School were fully ensconced in academia rather than writing for party journals. Their particular interest in Marxism and its analytical tools had no necessary connection to political practice. The complication of Gramsci's relation to Western Marxism, even more than figures like, for example, Karl Korsch or Georgi Lukács, is that there's a sharp division in his life created by his jailing by the Mussolini regime and indeed the crushing of the Communist Party by fascism. So from the period of World War I up till 1926, Gramsci was immersed in the life of the Italian socialist and then from 1921 communist parties. But he wrote his most important theoretical work in prison from 1929 to 1935. His fragmentary prison notebooks suggest the need for a specific approach to building political hegemony in a Western industrialized country with a developed civil society, so distant from the idea of a militarized party storming the Winter Palace. But crucially, these writings stood apart from his own immediate political realities, and they comment little on developments like the contemporary situation in the Comintern. They make only very sparing comments on the Stalin-Trotsky split, and so on. For some, this is broadly a good thing, making Gramsci's works timeless, or at least constitutively malleable or open to interpretation. There's lots of writers on this, people like David Forgach. To take a recent example, there's a recent edited collection called Gramsci in the World, in which Frederick Jameson argues that Gramsci's value owes precisely to his ambiguities. In jail, he had to pass his writings via the fascist kind of prison censor before they were handed back to him, and thus he resorted to various sort of circumlocutions designed to avoid setting off alarm signs. So hence, Gramsci in prison notebooks writes of philosophy, the philosophy of praxis, rather than Marxism. He refers to the modern prince, where he means the Communist Party, and so on. So Jameson suggests that if these are disguises imposed by an external conditioning, they may also express what Jameson says, a more complex internal and subjective situation, which might have led Gramsci himself, in the course of seeking alternative phrasing, into wholly new paths and new problems. In the same vein, Jameson breezily dismisses the central role of the Communist Party in Gramsci's worldview, indeed passing this off as a kind of statist bogeyman directed against him by various anti-communists. In this reading, it's precisely the application of Gramscian categories to subjects and situations he could never have imagined, which, quote, makes for the freshness and adaptability of his thinking, its suggestiveness as a resource for contemporary theory, not some model or party line that he never offered in the first place. For Jameson, it's precisely the ambiguity of Gramsci's analyses of this or that issue or topic that makes for the richness of his work and its urgent relevance for us today. In one aspect, this may sound compelling. Gramsci, after all, wouldn't be much use if he'd merely described his own times. Obviously, his critique of the Italian Socialist Party's failure to analyze the class realities of Italy, his call for an alliance of southern peasantry and northern industrial workers, isn't just of interest for historians of Italy. Rather, it poses a problem, already posed by Marx in his critique of the Gotha program, where he critiques Ferdinand Lassalle's idea of the proletariat as counterposed to the rest of the classes, all held to be a monolithic reactionary mass. Equally, Gramsci's focus on culture, meaning not the arts, but something rather like common sense, the space in between economic base and sort of superstructure, the level of political tactics, the in-between space where hegemony, where common sense is formed, that hardly need be reduced to the immediate situation of interwar Italy or the particular fascination then exerted by the rising US hegemon. Yet it seems rather strange to suggest that the interest of redeploying Gramsci's categories in new and different contexts should rely on them being ambiguous. By analogy, Marx's focus on the factory as the center of the production process and capital may seem rather antiquated, bearing the kind of expectations of his time in which the working class would be sort of physically united and concentrated through the growth of factory labor. Of course, in writing, in understanding the capitalist societies of our own time and the models of work therein and so on, that needs to be properly historicized, and Marx's expectations seen within the contours of their time. Yet it would seem strange to suggest that this necessary historicization would rely on the idea that Marx's writing was itself ambiguous or based on equivocation. Equally, when we look at the concrete history of the socialist and communist parties at the turn of the 20th century, we nowhere find majority industrial working class, and that existed even less in the lifetime of Karl Marx. It's thus often rather puzzling to be confronted with the assumption that Gramsci's idea of a sort of multiform working class allied with other subaltern groups was an innovative breakthrough challenging some presumed orthodoxy. This portrayal of Gramsci in terms of ambiguity, innovation, heterodoxy, rather than his concrete record of political action, is broadly characteristic of both his immediately political uses and his use in sort of scholarly fashions. Aside from a general rejection of Leninism and lack of interest in the activity of the early Italian Communist Party, this phenomenon seems especially driven by a certain academic tendency to assert individual, even private ownership over ideas, regardless of the context in which they emanated. Indicative in this sense is the attribution to Gramsci of the idea of hegemony itself, the mix of consent and coercion with which one group establishes its leadership over others, while disregarding its earlier use in Russian social democracy and indeed the influence of that tradition on Gramsci personally. Looking at sort of more sort of left press or even like organs like the New Statesman talking about Gramsci, perhaps one of his most famous quotes is the call to mount a long march through the institutions, a phrase, in fact, not from him, but coined by Rudi Dutschke in 1967. Almost opposite to this, it's also quite common to hold Gramsci to be a kind of apostle of radical culture, the battle for hegemony outside of conventionally political spaces. Yet, if we think of German social democracy in the 1880s, the first and certainly most classic case of a popularized and vulgarized Marxism, it was doing precisely that. It's not an innovation of Gramsci's or new to the Italian Communist Party. Yet Gramsci provides a more palatable face for such ideas. In this, we could identify a certain comparison with Rosa Luxemburg, a figure more widely celebrated as a martyr than actually read. And the acclaim for her is all the more universal because she was murdered in January 1919 before decisive splits within the communist movement had taken place. So just as most currents on the left would be able to endorse one positive myth or another of Gramsci, Luxemburg's early death at the hands of combined fascist and social democrat reaction allows her to be a heroine of both East Germany, but also kind of libertarian post-Leninism, or indeed a radical democrat at odds with Bolshevism itself. In Gramsci's case, the irony is that his image in the trappings of heterodoxy, national particularity, and so on, is itself the product of the high Stalinist era. And the effects of this are particularly jarring today after the dissolution of the Italian Communist Party, the PCI. The biggest communist party in the West, after playing a decisive role in the World War II resistance, the PCI was briefly part of a broad anti-fascist government that designed Italy's new constitution, but it was banished from government in 1947 as the Cold War hardened, and for the next 4 decades remained a kind of loyal opposition within a Christian Democrat-dominated system. When this January, well, last month, mainstream media commemorated the now demised PCI's centenary, its foundation in 1921, They were essentially talking about the party that was created in 1943, the one that emerged from clandestinity during the resistance under the leadership of Palmiro Togliatti, and rather less of the Communist Party that actually took form in 1921. From the Comintern's 7th Congress in 1935 onward, all communist parties adopted national and patriotic hues. But the Italian party was more successful than most, in Western Europe at least, in asserting a distinct national theoretical tradition. And indeed, this would be erected precisely in the name of Gramsci. While in France, leader Maurice Thorez was himself the object of a Stalin-esque leader cult, in Italy, the rather uncharismatic Togliatti instead relied on his association with Gramsci. This also provided a means of distancing the PCI's leaders from their initial admiration of the party's most prominent figure in 1921, and namely Bordiga. We can think of lots of reasons why Italy had the biggest communist party in the West, many having to do with the weak incorporation of the masses into democratic life even before fascism, the long and deep complicity of its ruling classes with fascism, and the low social weight of the layers normally at the core of reformist social democracy. But the PCI was also shaped politically by the fact that it was crushed so early in its development, and indeed in the development of the Stalinist Comintern. So the party was founded in January 1921, but immediately faced heavy reprisals from black shirts. Already in October 1922, Mussolini was appointed prime minister, head of a coalition of liberals and conservatives, and the hardening of the fascist regime meant by the end of 1926, essentially all communist organization on Italian soil was eradicated. And the party continued to exist essentially as an exile apparatus, albeit with some ramifications in prison, prisons where, of course, there were large concentrations of cadres who'd been locked up, and so they were still together, so they were still organized. But the effect of this basically was that, despite various abortive attempts to send cadres from exile in France back into Italy, essentially from 1926 onwards, it was impossible to create a Stalin loyalist party on Italian soil. And most of the militants who weren't exiled or in jail had almost no idea of what was going on in the Comintern. And so this meant things like, for example, there was no pre-war development of a popular frontist party, as in obviously in France and Britain and so on. And there was no Hitler-Stalin pact moment. So effectively, the fight to recreate the Communist Party during the resistance itself, from 1943 to 1945, had to go through that sort of work of changing militants' expectations in terms of creating a popular frontist party that wasn't immediately struggling for the workers' revolution and which didn't have a class against class policy. From September 1943, when the German invasion of Italy, the Communist Party was in a broad alliance with Christian Democrats, liberals and socialists called the National Liberation Committee, and from April 1944 also extending to include monarchists, a common front against Nazi Germany, aligned, of course, to the Anglo-Americans. So in the party that was created in 1943 to 5 was very unlike that which had existed up until 1926. In an interview during the centenary, Massimo D'Alema, from 1998 to 2000, Italy's first ex-communist prime minister, he said the PCI was always a reformist party. Such a comment makes some sense if we take the party of 1943 to 1991 as essentially a self-contained experience. Yet such a force could hardly be created with no reference to the party that had gone before in the early 1920s. And Antonio Gramsci, jailed at the end of this first period and now dead, died in 1937, provided the essential link between the two periods. Though he had in fact broken off all contact with Togliatti in 1926, after Togliatti refused to pass on his letter to the Russian Communist Party leadership, critical of its handling of the left opposition, Togliatti nonetheless became a kind of literary executor of Gramsci's. And in 1939, himself in Moscow came into possession of the prison notebooks, which Gramsci had written between 1929 and 35. Gramsci had expressed his wish to leave some trace for eternity, as he put it. Yet the way these writings came to light was very contradictory, an assertion of a national tradition, but within the parameters of an openly Stalinist party. The one remarkable aspect of the use of Gramsci in the war period is the very low pre-existing consciousness of his work among the communist base. Firstly, this was because a minority of the 1926 era membership were again members of the party in 1945, and also because the prison notebooks were not yet published. After 1921, the party membership was never more than a few tens of thousands, and after 1926, only around 5,000. But after rapidly surging during the resistance period and the immediate aftermath of the war, it hit almost 2 million members by the end of the 1940s. So, in essence, a totally different party and certainly a totally different membership. Nonetheless, this rebuilding of a new party had to confront sizable dissident currents, many of which openly invoked the supposed revolutionary class against class orthodoxy of the early 1920s in opposition to popular frontism. Striking in this dissident press is the almost complete lack of reference to Gramsci as a distinct thinker, either positively or negatively commenting on his pre-1926 role. Before Togliatti's own return to Naples from Russian exile in March 1944, after 20 years abroad, Gramsci was presented in the PCI's own daily newspaper, L'Unità, exclusively as a kind of martyr of fascism, rather than as a bearer of a distinct strategic vision. The Gramsci reflected in Togliatti's articles upon his return had reverential tone. So it like discusses him as the, calls him like the party's founder, which is a way of like kind of clearing the memory of Bordiga out of the way. Bordiga was expelled in 1930. And here in articles in April 1944 was the first mention that the prison notebooks existed, but actually during the resistance period, Togliatti made no public mention of their content. And so this period, with the hardening of a new communist party with a popular frontist line and with Gramsci as its icon, in this kind of lies one of the great ironies of the sort of general left opinion of Gramsci's role. Because while he is venerated as a champion of a kind of democratic notion of the generation of ideas, him saying, every man is a philosopher, but not all have the social function of intellectuals. In practice, the creation of the Gramsci cult by the Italian Communist Party kind of stands as a kind of tombstone over the kind of worker communist thought of the resistance period and the opposition to the kind of party that was now taking form. And all of this kind of worker communism remains essentially ignored, despite the fact that there actually is quite a lot of source material if you're willing to look for it. An interesting recent line of historiography, particularly for kind of pre-World War I social democratic parties, which we see in the likes of figures like Andrew Bonnell and Jean-Numa Ducange, focuses on the degree to which figures which we think of as great classics of Marxism were actually read and understood by the mass of party militants. And thinking of Italian socialism in an earlier period in the 19th century, a very useful work is Paolo Favilli's History of Italian Marxism, which explores both the influence of Marxism on academic disciplines like sociology and the diffuse spread of Marx's ideas in the workers' movement. And to get an idea of what this book says, I'll take the illustrative case of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. So the German edition, published in February 1848, you'll all know in the first few lines it announces forthcoming translations: English, French, Danish, Flemish, and Italian. But even the first partial Italian translation wasn't published until 1889, some 4 decades later, after Marx's death, and the full translation only emerged 2 years after that. So what Favilli shows is how consciousness of Marx instead spread through a kind of osmosis via other authors, in particular through anti-socialist writers who presented him as a defender of a rigid economic determinism, but also succeeded in spreading his reputation as a kind of apostle of class war on the side of the workers. Equally important were approving references to him as an economist in the workers' clubs at the time, which were largely dominated in the period of the First International by Bakuninites. So in the press of the kind of autodidact workers' clubs, they have this extremely confused notion of Marx through the prism of kind of reference points they really do understand. So, for instance, Marx would often appear as the defender of the iron law of wages, the phrase of Lassalle, but certainly part of the kind of popular understanding of economic determinist ideas in this early phase of the workers' movement. Or, for instance, Marx would appear in sort of mastheads and wood carvings and this kind of thing, banners, as a great revolutionary, but very much shaped by the kind of dominant conspiracist and insurrectionary idea of the great day of the seizure of power. So in this regard, Favilli, he cites a portrait of Marx as a masked bandit on horseback, spreading the revolution around Europe. An obviously un-Marxist and Bakuninite perspective, but projected onto this friend of the working man. And indeed, in his own 1925 introduction to the Communist Party's party school, Gramsci himself sort of refers to this, talking of Marx as a figure who isn't so much read by Marxists as attacked by opponents, and sort of literary references to Marx appearing as dressing for the sources produced by others. And I think we can compare this kind of reception of Marx to the use of Gramsci in post-World War II Italy, a kind of folk icon and anti-fascist martyr, with even the presentation of his more theoretical works heavily governed by the PCI's own immediate political imperatives and the assumptions of the popular frontist Comintern. Of course, the Comintern had dissolved in 1943, but I mean the popular frontism that had derived from the 7th Congress of 1935 and still reigned in the post-war communist parties. Gramsci interpretation from this period onward would often sort of assert him as the as a heterodox thinker, but while also sort of pursuing a standard biblical use of texts to say everything that conditions demanded and its opposite. So the Gramsci of PCI law was thus the first Leninist in Italy, a way of, again, of removing Bordiga from the picture, but he was also the endpoint of a national tradition of progressive thinking by philosophers like Benedetto Croce and Antonio Labriola. So the edition of when the prison notebooks actually were published, which began in 1948 and ended in 1951, in an edition edited by Togliatti and Felice Platone, reflected this attempt to present Gramsci as the kind of end point in the development of a national, progressive, democratic outlook. A lot of sort of academic philologists interpreting Gramsci's writings, and as I mentioned earlier, people like Jameson, for whom this whole idea of the kind of ambiguity as the reason to be excited about Gramsci, they're very critical of these this published edition of the prison notebooks because it organizes Gramsci's writings into thematic volumes, rather than actually respecting the character of the texts themselves, which was that Gramsci kind of drafted a series of texts that were never actually completed. So this kind of gives them a more sort of systematic or finished character. But perhaps more importantly, in the edition of these texts is the manipulation of them to remove anything that clashed with the PCI's actual political practice in the post-war period. So there's all of the negative references to parliamentarism are removed, and as are the various comments on Bordiga and Trotsky. Of course, in reality, very few members actually read these volumes. Instead, he appeared as a kind of cipher for the party's claim to be the democratic party of all Italians, united by anti-fascism and the values of the constitution written at the end of the war. This was based on the idea of broad alliances loosely wrapped around Gramsci's notion of hegemony, and in particular the idea of the working class and its party as a force that would have to take up all of the questions of national life and impose their leadership over others. But what is almost entirely absent from the PCI literature of the post-war period is a frank recognition of the reality that their strategy and its defensive character, the abandonment of the idea of the sort of immediate seizure of power, the need for broad alliances, the focus on democracy above and democratic republican institutions above all else. There's essentially no recognition of the fact that that's a defensive strategy imposed by the reality of American hegemony, and that really it's creating a sort of counter-hegemonic space within a Christian Democrat dominated political system. So indeed, from 1947, when the PCI is kicked out of government, until 1991, every single government has the Christian Democrats as the largest party, and the Communist Party is always in opposition. The PCI did have a real achievement, though, which was to impose its right to organize, despite the strong pressure from ex-fascist personnel and the CIA and church allies in the sort of harsh anti-communism of the immediate post-war period. And for 30 years, Italy was not Greece, and the PCI was not like the KKE as a sort of crushed clandestine party under a fascist dictatorship. And that doubtless had a great deal of positive impact for Italian democracy and for working class life. What remained ever unclear was the party's project for transcending its position as a subordinate loyal opposition within the post-war republic. It implicitly being understood that it would eventually build up its forces through gradual accretion, expanding democracy in a series of stages that would eventually arrive at socialism. In the 1970s, under leader Enrico Berlinguer, This took the form of a proposed alliance as a junior partner to Christian democracy, so a way of giving it a role in state institutions or indeed in national government. And this had actually already been achieved a decade earlier by the much smaller Socialist Party. So when Aldo Moro was the leader of the Christian Democrats, he had drawn the Socialists into his coalition as a junior partner in the early 60s, as to give the government a certain sort of ability to a certain kind of base of support within the labour movement. And Moro tried something similar with the Communist Party in 1976. And of course, Moro was the Christian Democrat who was kidnapped by the Red Brigades and murdered in order to prevent this fully being realized. So in the late 70s, the Communist Party provided outside support to the Christian Democrat government, but without ever having any ministers. Indeed, while the PCI was certainly a mass party with 2 million members and a strong counterweight, always the biggest, the second biggest electoral force, it was poorly able to advance any kind of alternative reformist project for Italian society, or indeed set what we might call an alternative set of sort of hegemonic values able to reorder the political terrain. In particular, this owed to the fact that the vision beloved of dominant figures in the party like Giorgio Amendola held that Italy still needed to complete its bourgeois democratic revolution and to focus on the inherent backwardness of Italian capitalism. And this was a rather limiting perspective in a period in which Italy, having been indeed a backward agricultural country with a few islands of industry before World War II, through the 50s and 60s was one of the fastest growing capitalist economies in the world, on a par with countries like West Germany and Japan, and in fact ultimately surpassed Britain for GDP. And indeed the Communist Party was also particularly weak in its response to the crisis of Keynesianism after the 1973 oil shock. So actually in the period of the historic compromise, the period of its support for Christian democracy, it backed wage restraint and limiting of working class incomes in order to combat inflation. And what this essentially showed was that while it talked about building a broad hegemonic alliance and putting itself at the center of a vast democratic coalition, it did so in a way which subordinated it essentially to the imperatives of the growth of Italian capitalism. And so when the post-war growth stalled and when there was, as I say, high inflation, it actually started to turn against the material interests of its own base. Of course, beyond Italy, the Euro-communist trend advanced by Berlinguer was largely as a route away from Leninism. So, the Communist Party in Italy had long defined its notion of revolution negatively. The insistence this can't just mean the storming of the Winter Palace. And when in 1981, Berlinguer said that the propulsive force that began with the October Revolution had been exhausted, this essentially formalized the end of the idea of a revolutionary transformation of society, always at most latent within the PCI. So for good English language sort of illustration of this, there's a book which is Eric Hobsbawm interviews Giorgio Napolitano in 1975 and 1977 called The Italian Road to Socialism. And Napolitano would in the 2000s become the first ex-communist president of the Republic. And what we see in this is that the whole idea of a socialist end goal is explicitly abandoned in favor of ideas like democratic programming, which is a bit like a kind of Gaullist idea of national industrial champions and a sort of guided but capitalist economy, sustainable capitalist development, these kind of ideas. Nonetheless, within the sort of militant culture of the party base, both its sort of origins in the post-1917 revolutionary wave, and even in some sense the fact that its members had after all taken up arms to conquer democracy in the 1940s, meant that there was some sort of residual idea of insurrection, revolution, also compounded by the fact that the party wasn't able to become a national government. We could draw a certain analogy with sort of pre-World War I German social democracy, in the sense that the fact that the reformist path is effectively blocked means that sort of different sort of souls of the party, or different sort of strategic options, the clash between them isn't properly resolved. So the kind of overall revolutionary image persists. But in 1991, when the party was finally dissolved with the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and so on, it was clear that the party was in a sense kind of less than the sum of its parts. In fact, what resulted from that was not even a social democratic or reformist party. The large bulk of the party just became pro-European liberals, and then a small minority continued as Rifondazione Comunista, although its sort of ability to propose a sort of general transformation of Italian society was certainly very limited, and the party was quite embedded in kind of these ideas like, rather than be a Leninist vanguard, what we should be is the party of struggles that represents new social movements and this kind of thing. Beyond Italy, the appeal of Euro-communism owed a lot to the idea of breaking with the centrality of the working class as the subject of social change, and indeed ending the idea of a socialist end goal. That's not to say, however, that all the uses of Gramsci in this context were simply crude ideological manipulations. For instance, as an analysis of Thatcherism and its success in pushing its kind of counter-revolution within British society, Stuart Hall's work represents a decent, if not uncontroversial, application of Gramscian categories, indeed outside of Italy. Yet Hall's work is obviously marked by its disconnect with the political project which Gramsci's own work had centered on. Marxism today and its vision of broad alliances against Thatcherism, and in this spirit, the embrace of Neil Kinnock and his War on the Left, sought not to create, as Gramsci had intended, a new alliance around rising layers of the working class, but instead to write off the old bases of strength and tail small social movements, NGOs and such like, as alternatives to the labour movement. If Hall's own political trajectory, witheringly attacked by Ralph Miliband, could be taken as tragic, today we see the farcical re-edition in the use of Gramsci by the former Trotskyist Paul Mason. Mason's own political formation, still visible in his constant deployment of Comintern era analogies, would, I wouldn't doubt, lead him to consider the Togliattian use of Gramsci as a case of Stalinist manipulation, imposing nationalist and popular frontist dogma on Gramsci. Yet Mason himself uses Gramsci in order to praise Keir Starmer's concessions to lowest common denominator popular nationalism, insist on the need for national defense, standing up to Russia and China, this kind of thing. Gramsci did indeed say that the Workers' Party has to do more than cater to its own base and establish its moral and intellectual leadership in society as a whole. But never in Gramsci is this allied to the idea of taking the ideological imperatives of bourgeois politics for granted, or simply presenting the Communist Party as better exponents of the existing hegemonic values. Or in Mason's account, there's also a sort of space for radical culture, stuff like the world transformed, and this kind of thing. But I think Mason's account is really typical of a certain kind of use of Gramsci as a sort of intellectual stardust, a bit like a priest speaking in Latin in order to give proceedings an air of magic. But there's no actual use of Gramsci's intentions or any deployment of his categories. I'm not going to go into much depth about the use of Gramsci in academia, so things like international relations, subaltern studies in South Asia, and so on. But I'll briefly mention the state debate of the 1970s, because there were left Eurocommunist thinkers who engaged with Gramsci's work and the realities of the interwar Comintern in a spirit which I think can be said to be broadly consonant with Gramscian themes. So indicative of this is Nikos Poulantzas and his reading of the state, where he presents the state as both a terrain of struggle and what he calls the material condensation of a power relation between classes and class fractions. This had the quality of understanding the state neither as a monolithic fortress which could only be assailed from the outside, but nor did Poulantzas sort of naively take it as a sort of empty terrain that could be filled with any content. Rather, the state was shaped also by moments of working class resistance and breakthrough, but dominated by the conservative reaction against them. So the PCI's own characterization of the Italian Republic and its constitution, whose first article describes it as a sort of in the rhetoric of the post-resistance period, that the Constitution of Italy describes it as a democratic republic founded on labor. So the PCI tended to idealize this kind of rhetorical claim in the Constitution and was sort of naively confident in the gradual advance of progress through democratic means, while playing down the necessary dimension of conflict and breaking the existing state machine. And so Poulantzas, in this regard, had a superior reading. Also, he goes beyond a purely instrumental understanding of the state by recognizing the separation between the interests of individual capitalists in any given moment and then the demands of the overall reproduction of capitalism. Nonetheless, there are also very negative examples of this move to make the political level autonomous of the class actors in society, particularly taken to the extreme by the likes of Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. Their effort is essentially to free Gramsci of any remaining connection to the economic base and set all political strategy at a fundamentally superstructural and discursive plane. So where the PCI had made the industrial proletariat into the core of a broad popular alliance, a broad national interest, with at least a tendency to sort of muffle conflict and confrontation, the Laclau-Mouffe version of left populism removes this sense of a core strategic actor, removes the idea of the working class or Communist Party as a hegemonic force leading others. Instead, their sort of postmodern vision removes any kind of intermediate institutions, militants, cadres, programs, and so on, and in effect turns politics into a kind of marketing strategy where through purely discursive processes you define a new understanding of what the people is. The weakness of this approach and its distance from Gramsci is also notable in its focus entirely on the steps towards electoral breakthrough and not to the subsequent transformation of the state or the wider society. I think we can find a good example of this political approach in Syriza, able to build a broad coalition of electoral support, but then in practice entirely unable to bring about any kind of lasting change. In particular, I think you can say Louis Althusser was able to identify some of the reasons why Gramsci's work lends itself to this particular type of misuse. So not simply an ambiguous thinker who whose sort of cryptic phrasing could be read in many different ways, but rather that his interventions and the vision of the prison notebooks lends itself to be to a vision which removes the element of class conflict. And Althusser particularly focuses on the fact that Gramsci basically made no study of political economy. There's little sign of him having read or studied Das Kapital. And in the notebooks in particular, a focus on the particular historical moments of the formation of political hegemony tends to overshadow the idea of modes of production. So it's Gramsci's kind of discussion is at the level of the formation of political alliances rather than the way in which modes of production take form across history. Even so, I think it can be said that Gramsci doesn't deserve epigons such as he's had. Obviously, any theorist's work has to be able to be renewed and built upon. Yet I think the dominant trend in Gramsci's work, particularly due to his reputation within the canon of Western Marxism, is to evacuate the core and permanent focus of his work, which is the demands of building a communist party and carrying out the socialist transformation of state and society. A lot of figures seeking to recover Gramsci from the Togliattian tradition, particularly in the new left of the 1960s, figures like Lelli or Bassa, looked particularly fondly on sort of other earlier dimensions of Gramsci, holding up his youthful writings in opposition to the prison notebooks. So in particular, he had a kind of councilist phase in 1919 to 20 during the occupation of the factories and the creation of the so-called workers' commissions in the factories of Turin. And at the time, Gramsci labeled these as the embryos of Soviet power in Italy. So this focus on kind of bottom-up workplace democracy has evident attractions for various kinds of anti-Stalinism and indeed even anti-Leninist currents, looking for an alternative to the failed models of 20th century socialism. Nonetheless, I'd argue that this is a temporary moment in Gramsci's work, which he overcomes in a particularly interesting way, relevant for us now. And I think the aspect of Gramsci which is perhaps least studied and discussed is precisely his activity within the Communist Party between 1921 and 1926. So his record here is hardly a spotless one, and indeed certainly challenges the idea of him as a great democrat in the way that he became the effective leader of the party. Earlier I mentioned a comparison with Rosa Luxemburg, and I think it's interesting if you look at Eric Blank's work on her sort of authoritarian leadership of pre-1914 social democracy of Poland and Lithuania. We get a very different picture of Luxemburg from the kind of eternal defender of the right to think differently and dissent, and the kind of libertarian idealized idea of Luxemburg. And in the Italian case, the way that Gramsci was imposed as the effective party leader in all but name in place of Bordiga was orchestrated by the Comintern imposed from above, never approved by the massive militants. Nonetheless, I would, and I'll sort of finish on this, I think it's important to avoid sort of reacting against the sort of Togliattian use of Gramsci in a reductive way that sees him, as some left communists put it, as kind of Stalin's man in Italy. In fact, in Gramsci's development between 1920 and 1930, there are several moments of reflection that sort of draw him at points closer to Bordiga than setting them in opposition. So in the period of the factory councils in Turin, Bordiga strongly challenged the idea that these were embryonic Soviets. In particular, he emphasized that the Soviets in Russia were political organs, not representations of workplaces or economic type demands alone. And Bordiga's central focus is the idea that only the formation of a party could overcome the various sort of petty sectionalisms of particular groups of workers, overcome geographic divisions between more and less industrialized regions, and so on. And this is an argument that I think Gramsci in part takes up. So in 1919-20, he often emphasized the idea that workplace councils would be the bases of the future workers' state. Given the very weak leadership of the Socialist Party of the time, this kind of seems like an alternative. But the reflux of the movement in the workplaces, the fact that the workers are organizing in their workplaces, however militant, whatever the occupation and so on, the fact that that doesn't produce a revolutionary transformation of society, the fact that they can't draw in other subaltern layers, helps convince him of the centrality of the party. Nonetheless, there's important differences between them. I won't go into here the sort of tactical questions of anti-fascism and the United Front and so on, important as those are. But I think the thing which is most useful to draw from Gramsci and, if you will, the sort of spirit of his work, is his idea of the form of the party and its militants. Bordiga very strongly opposes the idea that the revolution is a matter of organizational forms. Also we can think, for instance, of in the Trotskyist tradition, a certain idea of a sort of like latent class consciousness, which just needs to be organized and given leadership. The famous Trotsky quote on the crisis of humanity is the crisis of working class leadership. But I think that Gramsci's understanding is better able to cope with periods of defeat, is better able to build up a mass communist presence in society, to, in his words, make a working class force that's able to become the state, as he calls it. So it's the preparation of the working class to become the ruling class in society. So where Bordiga's idea is basically militarized cadre organization swept to power by a capitalist crisis, Gramsci's focus is instead on the building the kind of scaffolding of working class democracy, building the structures and the platform within which workers can indeed become leaders. In particular, I think what's interesting here is that Gramsci stands very far from the kind of idea of kind of direct democracy, referenda, the kind of direct, the sort of mythologization of kind of like whatever workers happen to think is like what the left should be listening to. Rather, it's about the process by which you can make workers into leaders of within the framework of the party. So what he talks about is the collective intellectual. So it's not just the mass of whatever workers happen to think, but it's the process by sort of creating a sort of higher level synthesis of the various demands and aspirations within society. So this is opposite to the kind of Laclau idea of the party as a kind of empty cipher, or just the sort of the mass of the people and their rage against the elites. So Gramsci, in his 1925 article for the Ideological Preparation of the Masses, writes that the party is not democratic in the vulgar sense, but rather seeks to marry centralization and a kind of communist pedagogy through which worker leaders, not professional revolutionaries, can emerge and form a vanguard in society. So this obviously in ways is overlaps with Lenin's conception of the party, but has a much greater emphasis on its mass dimension, its building of its forces within democratic society. So I think that this element of Gramsci's thinking is what is sort of most fruitful and most important for us to draw on today, rather than sort of just taking him as a sort of smart sounding reference point.